Years after my family cut ties with me due to my stepsister's false accusations, I received an unexpected email. Reflecting on it, I never anticipated any of this. It was just an ordinary day, and I was unwinding in my room after work, scrolling through my phone when I heard the front door slam. My stepsister Sarah stormed in furiously, her face flushed, her eyes swollen from tears. Before I could even ask what was wrong, she yelled, "You've ruined my life." I blinked, stunned, trying to make sense of her words. "What are you talking about?" I asked, feeling utterly lost. She marched up to me, jabbing her trembling finger in my face. You've been sleeping with Jason. I know what you did, Jason, her husband." My heart sank. "Are you serious? That's insane," I replied. But Sarah wasn't listening. She was in a full-blown hysterical fit, hurling accusations in every direction. "Don't lie to me. I saw the texts. I know you've been sneaking around behind my back." I was in shock. Texts? Sneaking around? Jason and I had hardly spoken outside family gatherings. The thought of an affair was so far-fetched I couldn't even grasp it. Before I could respond, my parents entered. My mom took one look at Sarah and rushed to her side. "Sarah, honey, what's going on?" Sarah turned to them, her voice shaky and tearful. "She's been sleeping with Jason. I caught them." My mom gasped, covering her mouth, while my dad's face turned red with anger. He fixed me with a cold, accusing look. "Is this true?" he asked. "No, of course not," I shot back, a mixture of panic and anger rising within me. "Sarah's making this up," but my words were meaningless. They had already decided. My mom was shaking her head in disbelief, muttering, "I can't believe this. I thought you were better than this, Mom. Please listen." I pleaded, desperate. "There's nothing going on between Jason and me," but Sarah, still acting the victim, clung to my mom's arm. "Don't believe her lies. She's been jealous of me for years. She wanted to ruin my marriage." "Jealous? Are you kidding?" I retorted, laughing despite the absurdity of the situation. "You're the one who's always been jealous, Sarah. Always trying to make me look bad." My dad wasn't having it. "Enough," he barked. "We're not going to stand here listening to your denials. Sarah wouldn't make this up." I felt like I was in a nightmare. How could they believe her without any proof, without even considering my side? "Dad, please," I tried again. "Think about it. Why would I do this?" Jason and I barely even speak, but my words fell on deaf ears. My mom was crying now, and my dad just shook his head. "You've hurt this family enough," he said. "You need to leave." My heart stopped. "What you heard me," he repeated firmly. "Pack your things and go." I was speechless. My own parents were kicking me out, believing I'd had an affair with my stepsister's husband without a shred of evidence. It felt as if the ground had disappeared beneath me. I looked to Sarah, hoping for some glimmer of guilt, a sign that she realized how outrageous this was. But she simply smirked, wiping away her fake tears. She knew exactly what she was doing. I turned back to my parents, praying they'd change their minds. "Please," I whispered, my voice cracking. "You're making a mistake," but they were unyielding. My mom wouldn't even look at me, and my dad repeated, "Get out." I had no choice. In a daze, I went to my room, grabbed a few belongings, and left the house. My mind was racing, my heart pounding. How did this happen? How did my life turn upside down in mere minutes? As I walked down the street, the weight of what had just occurred crashed over me like a tidal wave. My family, the people who were supposed to love and support me, no matter what, had just cast me aside. All because of a lie. I found myself sitting on a park bench, staring at my phone, debating who to call. But who would believe me? My parents hadn't. Sarah had everyone wrapped around her finger. I felt utterly alone. The night air was cold, but I barely noticed. I was too numb, lost in my thoughts. My life had been torn apart, and I had no idea what to do next. All I knew was that I couldn't go back until I found a way to prove my innocence. But how do you prove you didn't do something when everyone's mind is already made up? I sat there for hours, trying to make sense of everything, but no matter how much I thought, nothing added up. All I knew was that Sarah had won, at least for now, leaving me to gather the fragments of my broken life. Walking away from my parents' house that night felt like stepping into an empty void. I wasn't just leaving a place, I was abandoning everything I believed I could rely on. My family had betrayed me, plain and simple. And the worst part, they hadn't even cared enough to hear me out. I replayed the scene over and over in my mind: Sarah's accusations, my parents' cold stares, how they accepted her lies without a second thought. It made my blood boil. How could they? I had always been the one trying to keep the peace, always the one overshadowed while Sarah basked in the spotlight. And now, without any proof, they'd turned on me entirely. The night was frigid, and I had nowhere to go. I wandered the streets for hours, my mind spinning with questions. What had I done to deserve this? Why didn't my parents trust me? Was I that unimportant to them? Eventually, I found myself in front of Megan's apartment. She had been my closest friend, the one person I felt I could rely on without question. I knocked at her door, half expecting her to be asleep, but she opened it almost immediately. The expression on her face, a mix of confusion and concern, showed her surprise at seeing me, red-eyed and clutching a hastily packed bag. "What happened?" she asked, pulling me inside. That was the moment when I completely broke down. Everything I'd been holding and crashed down, and I started sobbing uncontrollably. Through my gasps, I tried to explain, "Sarah." She told my parents I was having an affair with Jason. Megan's eyes widened in disbelief. "What? That's ridiculous," she exclaimed. "I know," I replied, wiping my face, "but my parents, they believed her. They threw me out." She pulled me into a comforting hug, letting me release everything. "I can't believe they would do that," she murmured softly. "You didn't even get a chance to explain." I shook my head, feeling defeated. They didn't want to hear it. They just accepted her story. Megan sighed in frustration. "That's just unfair. You don't deserve this." I ended up crashing on her couch that night, barely sleeping, haunted by images of Sarah's smug face and my parents' disapproving looks. My entire world had shattered, and I was left trying to make sense of it all. The following morning, Megan made coffee and sat across from me. "So, what's the plan?" she asked. I shrugged, staring into my mug. "I don't know. I guess I need to find a place to stay and figure out my next move." "You can stay here as long as you need," she offered without hesitation. I was grateful but didn't want to impose. "Thank you, Meg. I really appreciate it, but I can't stay here forever. I need to sort things out." Over the next few days, I stayed at her place, trying to get my bearings. I started searching for apartments and applying for more jobs to save up. But the betrayal from my family hung over me, like a heavy shadow. Every time I thought about it, my chest ached with a painful mix of anger and sadness. I tried reaching out to my parents, hoping they'd listen to my side, but each call went straight to voicemail, and my texts were ignored. It felt as if I had ceased to exist to them, and that hurt more than anything. Out of sheer desperation, I eventually went back to their house. I stood on the porch, debating whether to knock, and finally did. My mom opened the door, her expression cold and distant. "You shouldn't be here," she said flatly. "Mom, please," I begged, "can we talk?" "I didn't do what Sarah said. You have to believe me." She shook her head. "We've made our decision, Mom. You're casting me aside over something I didn't do," I pleaded, my voice breaking. "I'm your daughter." For a brief moment, her eyes softened, showing a hint of guilt, but it vanished almost instantly. "You need to leave," she repeated. I stood there, hoping she'd reconsider, but she simply closed the door, leaving me on the porch feeling more alone than ever. As I walked away, a painful realization hit me. They weren't going to change their minds. They had chosen Sarah, and nothing I could say would change that. It was a harsh reality to face, but I knew I had to move on. Back at Megan's, I focused on finding a new place. I didn't have much saved, but I found a small studio apartment within my budget. It wasn't fancy, but it was a start. Megan helped me move, and even though it was tiny and worn down, having my own space felt like a small victory. Yet, the hurt from my family's betrayal stayed with me. Every night, lying on the mattress Megan lent me, I thought about my parents and how quickly they discarded me, trusting Sarah's lies without question. The pain was a constant wound, slow to heal, despite my efforts to focus on building a new life. Through it all, Megan was my anchor, keeping me grounded. "You're stronger than you realize," she would say. "You'll get through this." I wanted to believe her, but thoughts of my family, the ones who were supposed to love me unconditionally, felt like a blade twisting in my heart. How does one move on from that? How do you rebuild your life when the foundation has crumbled? Even though I didn't have all the answers, I knew I couldn't let Sarah's lies define me. Piece by piece, I started putting my life back together. Settling into my tiny apartment was strange at first. It wasn't much, just a single room with a bed in one corner, a small table, and a kitchenette that looked like it was from a 90s sitcom. But it was mine, and after everything, having something of my own felt like an accomplishment. I didn't have much furniture, just the basics Megan helped me find. It was almost bare and a little sad looking, but it was a start. The first few days were tough. I'd come home from work and just sit there, staring at the walls. The silence was overwhelming. Back at my parents' house, even on quiet days, there was always some background noise: the TV in the living room, my mom cooking, or Sarah's endless chatter. Now it was just me, and the emptiness was hard to bear. But I couldn't let myself spiral. I'd already lost my family. I wasn't about to lose myself too. So I started small, making a list of things I needed to do: unpack, buy groceries, maybe add a few decorations to make the place feel less like a box and more like a home. The unpacking didn't take long. I didn't have much, just a few clothes, some books, and the essentials Megan had given me. Grocery shopping was an adventure. I had to budget carefully, making every dollar count. I wasn't rolling in cash, but I was determined to make it work. After a few trips to thrift stores, I found a few items to liven up the place: a secondhand rug to cover the cold floor, some cheap picture frames, and a plant that I'd probably kill within a week. Still, it made a difference. Slowly, my apartment started feeling less like a temporary refuge and more like a place to live. Work became my escape. I threw myself into my job, picking up extra shifts whenever possible. It wasn't glamorous, but it kept my mind occupied. Every time I let my thoughts wander, they drifted back to my family, to Sarah, and to the life I'd lost. Staying busy was the only way to keep those thoughts at bay. Megan checked in on me regularly, pulling me out for coffee or a walk. Whenever I got too caught up in my thoughts, Megan was there to ground me. "You need a break," she'd say, pressing an overpriced cup of coffee into my hands. In those moments, I felt reassured that I wasn't entirely alone, even if my family had turned their backs on me. One weekend, Megan persuaded me to join her at a nearby farmer's market. It was one of those bright, beautiful days that practically begged you to be outside. Although I wasn't really in the mood, I agreed to go. As we strolled through the booths, something shifted. For the first time in weeks, I felt a small spark of happiness. It wasn't much, just a faint feeling, but it was there. We spent the afternoon laughing and talking, steering clear of the chaos that had taken over my life. It was a relief from the constant burden I'd been carrying, and I realized how much I needed that break. By the time we left, I felt a bit lighter, not entirely okay, but better. That night, sitting in my apartment, I looked at the small bunch of flowers I'd impulsively bought at the market and had a realization. I was starting to rebuild. It wasn't a dramatic transformation, and it wasn't happening quickly, but piece by piece I was putting my life back together. Days turned into weeks, and the numbness that had enveloped me when I first moved in began to fade. I developed a routine: wake up, go to work, return home, take care of the apartment, and repeat. It wasn't thrilling, but it was steady. And for the first time in a while, I felt a measure of control over my life. One evening, I decided to tackle a task I'd been avoiding: decorating the walls. It might sound trivial, but hanging up old photos and a few posters made a huge difference. It felt like I was finally claiming the space as my own. Each photo, each decoration was a reminder that this was my life now, not the life I'd expected, but the one I was creating. There were still tough days, mornings where the weight of everything felt crushing, making it hard to get out of bed. But I kept going, reminding myself that this dark period wouldn't last forever. I even picked up journaling again, something I hadn't done since I was a teenager. Writing my thoughts down helped, allowing me to put my emotions onto paper where they felt less overwhelming. I wrote about everything: my anger at Sarah, my disappointment in my parents, my worries about the future. It didn't fix everything, but it helped me make sense of my feelings. One entry stood out to me: "I don't know what tomorrow holds, but I'm still here, still fighting." Maybe that's enough. As the weeks turned into months, I found myself slowly releasing some of the anger. Not all of it, but enough to keep it from consuming me. I focused on what I could control: my job, my apartment, my future. Although the pain of losing my family never fully went away, it became a part of my story instead of defining it entirely. The journey wasn't easy. Some days felt like I was regressing rather than progressing. But each small step, each little victory, showed me a future that wasn't built around what I'd lost, but what I could build for myself. And that was something worth holding on to. Months passed since I'd moved into my small apartment. Life was still far from perfect, but I found a rhythm. Work kept me busy, and Megan's constant support reminded me I wasn't entirely alone. Yet, the pain of being cut off by my family lingered. No matter how much I focused on moving forward, I couldn't forget how quickly they'd abandoned me, choosing to believe Sarah's lies without hesitation. Then, one evening, everything changed. I was sitting on my couch after work, idly scrolling through my phone when an email notification appeared. The sender's name wasn't familiar, but the subject line froze me in place. You deserve to know the truth. My heart raced. I hesitated, thinking it might be some scam, but something compelled me to open it. The moment I did, I felt my breath catch. It was from Sarah's Jason, the husband she'd accused me of having an affair with. The email was straightforward. "Hey," it began. "I know this is probably unexpected, but I need to clear the air. I've held onto this for too long, and it's time you knew the truth." A mix of emotions, confusion, anger, and a strange glimmer of hope flooded over me. Why now? Why after all this time? Hands trembling, I kept reading. "Sarah lied," he wrote. "I know she accused you of having an affair with me, but none of it was true. The truth is, Sarah was the one who was unfaithful." I blinked, reading that line repeatedly, barely able to believe it. Jason continued, explaining everything. Sarah had been involved with someone else, a guy from her office. When Jason found out, she panicked and created a story to cover it up, blaming me to divert suspicion. "It was easier for her to throw you under the bus than to admit her own mistakes," he wrote. "I should have come forward sooner, but I was angry and hurt, so I let her lies take hold. I'm sorry." Attached were screenshots, texts between Sarah and her coworker, emails they'd exchanged, and even photos of them together. The proof was undeniable. She had been lying from the beginning. I sat there, staring at my screen, overwhelmed by a whirlwind of emotions. Relief, anger, sadness, they all hit me at once. After all the pain and betrayal, the truth had finally come to light. Jason ended his email simply, "I hope this helps. I'm sorry for everything you've been through because of us." Part of me felt relieved, validated. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't the person my family had painted me to be. But another part of me was furious. Furious at Jason for keeping silent for so long, furious at Sarah for her lies, and furious at my parents for believing her without a second thought. I sat there, lost in thought, staring at the email for what felt like hours. My mind raced, grappling with what to do next. Should I confront my parents? Should I reach out to Sarah? The evidence was right in front of me, but I wasn't sure if it would change anything. Would they even believe me now? I forwarded the email to Megan, and within minutes, my phone buzzed. It was her. "Holy crap," she said as soon as I answered. "Are you okay?" "I don't know," I admitted. I'm glad I finally know the truth, but it's a lot to process." Megan didn't push me to talk. She just listened as I vented, letting me work through it at my own pace. After we hung up, I sat in silence, contemplating my next move. I couldn't just keep this to myself. My family deserved to know the truth, even if it wouldn't magically fix everything. They needed to see the proof, to understand just how wrong they'd been. Yet part of me was terrified, afraid of facing them and uncertain of how they would react. The idea of stepping back into their lives after all they had done was overwhelming, but I knew I couldn't keep living under the weight of Sarah's lies. I needed to bring things to an end, and the only way to do that was by confronting them with the truth. I spent the night going through the screenshots, readying myself for the conversation that was inevitable. Each text, each email, reminded me of how easily Sarah had deceived them and how quickly my family had accepted her words. Now it was time to finally set things straight. Closing my laptop and preparing for bed, I felt a strange blend of emotions. The truth was finally out, but it wasn't the end, just the start of a new chapter where I would reclaim my story. For the first time in months, I felt a glimmer of hope. I didn't know what would happen, but I knew one thing: I wouldn't let Sarah's lies control me anymore. Now the truth was on my side, and it was time to face it. After reading Jason's email, I understood what I had to do. I couldn't keep this information to myself. My family needed to know the truth, even if it meant reopening old wounds. Facing them was terrifying, but I couldn't live under the weight of Sarah's lies any longer. They had to see the proof and realize the harm they'd done. The next morning, I woke up feeling both nervous and resolute. I spent hours reviewing the screenshots, rehearsing what I would say, and preparing for every possible reaction. By the afternoon, I knew it was time. I took a deep breath, grabbed my phone, and called my mom. She answered after a few rings, her voice cautious, as though she wasn't sure why I was calling. "Mom, it's me," I said, doing my best to keep my voice steady. I need to talk to you and Dad. It's important." There was a pause. "What is this about?" she asked, still guarded. "It's about Sarah," I replied, "and what she told you about me and Jason. I have proof that she lied." Another pause, this one longer. "Okay," she finally said. "Come over." Driving to their house felt surreal. I hadn't been there since the night they made me leave. Each street, each turn reminded me of the life I'd once had. By the time I pulled into the driveway, my heart was racing. I sat in the car briefly, trying to calm myself. Then I grabbed my phone and the printed emails and screenshots and walked to the door. My mom opened it before I could knock. She looked older, more worn out than I remembered. Without saying anything, she stepped aside, letting me in. My dad was in the living room, his expression unreadable. Sarah wasn't there, and I was relieved I wasn't ready to face her yet. I sat down across from them, hands slightly shaking as I handed them the papers. "I need you to read this," I said, watching as my mom took the papers and my dad leaned over her shoulder to read. The room was silent except for the sound of the papers. I watched their faces. My mom's eyes widened, and my dad's jaw clenched as they absorbed everything. When they finished, my dad finally spoke, his voice low. "This is from Jason." I nodded. "He sent me an email apologizing. Sarah was the one cheating, not me. She lied to cover her actions, and you believed her without question." My mom's hands trembled as she set the papers down. We didn't know," she whispered. "No," I replied, my voice sharper than I intended. "You didn't want to know. It was easier to accept her lies and blame me than to face the truth." My dad looked away, his face red with what I hoped was shame. "We thought we were doing the right thing," he muttered. "The right thing," I repeated, anger bubbling up. "You threw me out without even listening to my side. You didn't just believe Sarah's story, you destroyed my life based on her lies." My mom reached out, her eyes pleading. "We're sorry," she said, her voice breaking. "We didn't know what else to do." I pulled my hand away, shaking my head. "It's too late for that," I said. "Your apology doesn't undo what happened. I lost everything because of you, my home, my family, my peace of mind." My dad's voice softened. "We want to make it right. We know we made a mistake." I stood up, unable to stay seated any longer. "A mistake," I replied, my voice rising. "This wasn't just a mistake. You chose to believe a lie and cast me aside like I didn't matter. Now you want to make it right." They had no response. My mom just sat there, tears streaming down her face, while my dad stared at the floor. "I'm not here to make you feel better," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "I came because I needed you to know the truth and to see the harm you caused." "We know," my mom whispered. "We know we hurt you." I took a deep breath to steady myself. "I don't know if I can ever forgive you," I admitted, "but at least now you know the truth." With that, I turned and left the house. My heart pounded, my hands shook, but I felt a strange sense of relief. The truth was finally out, and they couldn't ignore it. They now knew the pain they'd caused, and it was up to them to live with it. As I got into my car and drove away, I felt a weight lift. It wasn't complete closure, but it was a step forward. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I'd reclaimed part of my life, and that was enough for now. Driving away from my parents' house after confronting them felt surreal. I wasn't just leaving their home, I was leaving behind years of anger, hurt, and betrayal. The truth was finally exposed, and they knew they had been wrong. But knowing and fixing things are two very different matters. For days afterward, I kept replaying the encounter in my mind, their faces as they read Jason's email, the heavy silence in the room as I revealed everything. It was all so vivid. Yes, they apologized, but apologies couldn't erase the years I spent feeling like an outsider, like the villain in a story I hadn't written. As always, Megan was there when I got home. She'd been my support through everything, and as soon as I walked in, she asked, "How did it go?" I shrugged, dropping my bag. They know the truth now. They apologized, but it doesn't really change anything. She nodded, offering a faint smile. "At least it's out there now. That has to feel a bit better, right?" I sank onto the couch, letting out a long sigh. "It does, I guess, but it's like I don't know how to feel." I had waited so long for them to finally see the truth, but now that they did, it felt strangely unsettling. Megan sat next to me, resting her hand on my shoulder. "Closure is complicated," she said. "It's not this neat little package that makes everything suddenly better." She was absolutely right. Closure isn't about perfectly resolving everything, it's about finding a sense of peace amidst the chaos. That's what I was trying to do, find some peace. In the days following, my parents tried to reach out. My mom texted nearly every day, asking if we could talk, if I'd come over for dinner, if we could start fresh. My dad even left a voicemail, which he rarely did, his voice strained as though he didn't know what to say but felt he needed to say something. "We're so sorry, sweetheart. We just want to make things right." But I wasn't ready. I wasn't prepared to sit at the dinner table and pretend everything was fine, as if the past few years hadn't happened. Their betrayal cut too deep, and while knowing the truth had helped, it didn't erase the hurt. I replied to my mom's text with short, polite messages telling her I needed time. Thankfully, she respected that. For once she wasn't pushing or trying to guilt me into forgiveness on her timeline. That small kindness gave me the space I needed to think. One evening, I decided to go for a walk. The weather was nice, and I needed to clear my mind. As I strolled through the park, I reflected on everything I had endured being thrown out, struggling to rebuild, the constant ache of losing my family. Now, standing on the other side of it all, I realized something important: I had survived. I had gone through one of the hardest, most painful experiences of my life, and I was still here. Sure, I had scars, but I wasn't broken. I had rebuilt my life, found a strength I didn't know I possessed, and proven to myself that I could endure even the worst betrayal. As I watched the sunset, a sense of calm washed over me. It wasn't a perfect peace, not as if everything was suddenly okay, but it was enough. Enough to remind me that I didn't need my parents' validation or their repeated apologies to move forward. I could find closure on my own terms. When I got back home, I decided to write them a letter, not a text or an email, but a real, handwritten letter. There was something about writing it out by hand that felt more genuine, more final. I sat down at my small table and started writing. "Dear Mom and Dad, I've been thinking a lot about everything that's happened, the lies, the betrayal, and now the truth. I know you're sorry, and I appreciate that. But I need you to understand that this isn't something that can be fixed overnight. The pain I've carried doesn't just vanish with an apology. I need time to process, to heal, and to figure out what a relationship with you might look like in the future. I'm not saying I'll never forgive you, but I'm not there yet. I hope you can understand. For now, I need space. I need to focus on myself and my life. Please respect that. When I'm ready, I'll reach out. Until then, take care. Love, my name." Writing that letter felt like lifting a weight off my shoulders. It wasn't about cutting them off forever. It was about setting boundaries and taking control of my own healing. I slipped the letter into an envelope, addressed it, and mailed it the next day. After that, I didn't hear from them for a while. They honored my request for space, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I could breathe. Update: after confronting my parents, I thought that was the end of it. I had spoken my truth, and I figured life would slowly move on. But as it turned out, karma had plans for Sarah, and honestly, I couldn't say I felt bad about it. It started small. A few weeks after leaving my parents' house, I got a call from Megan. "You won't believe what I just heard," she said, barely containing her excitement. "What's going on?" I asked, curious. "Apparently, Sarah's social circle is starting to crumble," Megan replied. "One of my coworkers knows her through mutual friends, and word is getting around about what she did." I felt a tiny spark of satisfaction. "What are people saying exactly?" "They're talking about how she cheated on Jason and then tried to frame you for it. People are starting to see through her lies." I couldn't help but smile. It seemed people were finally seeing Sarah for who she truly was. Over the following weeks, more stories trickled in. Megan would update me on the gossip, and it was clear that Sarah's reputation was taking a major hit. Friends who used to admire her were now keeping their distance, and people who once spent time with her stopped inviting her to things. It was like she was being slowly shut out from the social world she once dominated. Then came the news I didn't expect. One evening, my phone buzzed, and I saw a text from my mom. "We need to talk. Can you come over?" I hesitated, but curiosity got the better of me. When I arrived at their house, my mom looked exhausted, like she hadn't slept in days. My dad was in the living room, his expression as stern as ever. "We kicked Sarah out," my mom said without preamble. I blinked, stunned. "What?" "Why, she's caused more trouble than we can handle," my dad said, his voice gruff. Since her lies were exposed, Sarah's been lashing out, blaming us for her own mess, and we've reached our limit. I wasn't sure how to feel. Part of me felt relieved that they were finally seeing the truth about her. But another part of me was shocked that it had come to this. What exactly did she do? I asked, my curiosity piqued. She's been throwing fits, refusing to accept any responsibility, my mom said. After you left, things just got worse. She started causing scenes at home, and as her friends began distancing themselves, she took her frustrations out on us. My dad shook his head. We couldn't handle it anymore. She went too far. I leaned back, trying to take in everything they were telling me. So, where is she now? I asked. We don't know, my mom replied. She left last week, and we haven't heard from her since. I couldn't help but feel a strange mix of emotions. Sarah had always been the golden child in their eyes, someone who could do no wrong. And now, here they were, finally seeing her true colors. It was both satisfying and heartbreaking. She's dealing with the consequences of her own actions, my dad added. And we can't fix this for her, this time for the first time. I saw a hint of regret in their eyes, not just for letting Sarah go, but for how they had treated me. After that, I didn't hear much about Sarah for a while. Then, one day, I ran into an old friend from high school who knew her. Hey, she said, pulling me aside. Have you heard about Sarah? Not really, I replied. What's going on? She's pretty much on her own now, she said. Her friends have all cut her off. No one wants to be around someone who lies like that, I nodded, not surprised. Sounds about right. She's been reaching out to people, but no one's responding. Last I heard, she's staying with some distant relative out of town, trying to start over. Hearing that didn't give me the satisfaction I thought it would. Instead, it felt empty. Sarah had made her bed, and now she was lying in it. I didn't feel sorry for her, but I wasn't as triumphant as I'd expected either. Later that night, as I sat alone in my apartment, I reflected on everything that had happened. Sarah's downfall was entirely her doing. Her lies, her manipulation, they had all come back to haunt her. Now, she was left on her own, abandoned by her friends and even her family. It was a sort of poetic justice I hadn't anticipated seeing. But beyond that, it served as a reminder that every action has its consequences. Sarah's world had crumbled around her, and while I wasn't responsible for her downfall, seeing karma in action was enough. I didn't need to get involved. Life had a way of balancing things out on its own. In the end, I came to an important realization: I didn't need revenge to move forward. The truth was out, and Sarah was facing the repercussions of her choices. That was enough for me. I had my own life to focus on, and I wasn't going to waste any more energy on her or the past. Closure wasn't about getting even, it was about letting go, and that's exactly what I intended to do.